gone away, and it's been replaced with these newer age diets where people say paleo, although paleo could be an Ornish diet with just a little bit of meat in it. The big things in diet, especially scientific diet, are this concept of not consistently eating 3 meals a day. Whether the person does a 16-hour fast and only consumes their calories in 8 hours, or they do a full 24-hour fast and skip eating for 24 hours, that's a lot of what's new in the nutrition science community. It's what we're looking at. It's called alternate day fasting or caloric restriction. There are lots of different names for it, but that's come out of the mice world. And we see that mice who have their calories restricted actually live longer. And we're trying to figure out, if we translate that into humans, do we see similar benefits? The other thing that's new and old in diet, and a lot of what I spend my time doing, is a Mediterranean diet pattern. And I'm going to explain to you as we go on why that's both old and new. I want you to sit and think for a second before we get into the science. The interesting thing about my field is that I have 1 foot rooted in the popular press and 1 foot rooted in science. And you kind of have to straddle both lines whenever you're talking about nutrition. But ask yourself, who gave you your last piece of nutrition advice? Think about it for a second. Where did you get it? Was it from a magazine, a colleague, a trainer? Did it happen to come off something that was referenced on PubMed? Because my guess is it didn't. Very few of us actually go to the scientific papers to get nutrition advice. And this has a long history in our culture of science and popular press kind of working together. It actually started with the Kellogg Brothers. I'm from Kalamazoo, Michigan. Right down the road is Battle Creek, Michigan, which is where Kellogg's was. And the Kellogg Brothers were really trying to identify a food that would help people who needed to get nutritionally dense food, but couldn't eat a lot of bulky food. They were trying to find a way to get protein into vegetarian sources too, because they were Seventh-day Adventists, and they really wanted people to eat a more vegetarian diet. So they came up with what they called the perfect food, and that perfect food is flaked corn. They took corn, they found a way to dehydrate it, and in mass quantities create a product that was shelf-stable and could actually fill people up for long periods of time. This, of course, became cornflakes and many other cereals since then. We also have Ansel Keys. Ansel Keys started out, before he was in the heart disease world, as a military researcher, a military physician. And his goal was to find the absolute perfect package of food that you could stick in a soldier's backpack, and he could go out in the field for like weeks, basically 2 or 3 weeks on end, and be okay, which you'll notice cigarettes were a part of that pack, because cigarettes are a fantastic appetite suppressant. So you can give the soldier a couple of cigarettes and a little bit of food, and he can make it a lot further than he could have without the cigarettes. The K ration is not for Keys. It was the letter in the alphabet they had gotten to sequentially by then as they were building these different rations. I like to say even Homer Simpson knew it. There's a hilarious Simpson episode where Homer says, "I only eat food in bar form. When you concentrate food, you unleash its awesome power, I'm told. That's why I'm compressing 5 pounds of spaghetti into 1 handy mouth-sized bar." It's what we continue to try to do as a society. How do we take a little bit of nutrition knowledge, cram it into a small package, and start handing it to people to improve their health? And even Homer knew it. But let's go back to the science. A lot of what I spend time talking about is stroke, but today I'm here with nephrology. What do you tell your patients? I know when your patients come to you, they ask you what they're supposed to eat. So what do you tell them to prevent whatever disease? Stroke, kidney disease, hypertension, whatever it is that they're asking you about, what do you tell them? I'm going to try to leave you with the Mediterranean diet. I'm going to start with what it was, and we're going to talk about some data, and then come back to the Mediterranean diet at the end. But what is the Mediterranean diet? So Ansel Keys, who we saw from the World War II K rations, he actually came up with the Mediterranean diet in the 1950s. And he came up with it because he'd spent so much time in Italy and watched the way the people in the south of Italy had eaten. And he noticed a pattern of eating. He specifically contrasted that with businessmen in Minnesota. So he noticed that businessmen in Minnesota ate very differently than Southern Italians. And his patients in southern Minnesota, or in Minnesota, were having heart attacks more often than these people in southern Italy. So he described this diet that was full of legumes and fruits and vegetables and olive oil. And even in the 50s was saying he thinks this is the right way to eat. It wasn't popularized until the 90s when some Harvard researchers found a way to put numbers behind it and say, what is exactly a Mediterranean diet? And that's what we had in 1995. We actually had a score that we got from the folks at Harvard that told us it had to do with vegetables, fruits, beans and nuts, seeds, breads, unrefined grains, and olive oil. There also would be some fish and wine and very limited intakes of meat and dairy. The data I'm going to present for you today is from the REGARD study. REGARD stands for Reasons for Geographic and Racial Differences in Stroke. It's the epidemiological cohort that I work on at UAB with my colleague George Howard, who's in the audience today. REGARDS was a study that was designed to try to include more Americans rather than just having one city or 4 cities that you might recruit people from. We wanted people from across the U.S. because we really wanted to look at some of these geographic disparities in stroke. We have a central recruitment system where we use mail and the telephone to find our participants. We use Genesis to identify our participants. They were the same people in the 2000s that were selling your name to Ma Bell to have phone calls. Oh, would you like to switch your phone service? Very same group. So we used a computer-assisted telephone interview system to collect lots of variables on these folks that I'll go into later. We did get an in-home evaluation because, as George loves to say in his talks, the question, do you have undiagnosed hypertension, typically doesn't get the response that we're looking for in science. So we need to put our hands on these people, actually get their blood pressure to see what their blood pressure is. We collected labs, and we sent the blood and urine up to the University of Vermont. They're our central repository for the REGARD study. And we follow up people every 6 months to see what events they're having. Overall, our demographics come from the baseline interview, which is the telephone screen. We looked at major cardiovascular risk factors. Afterwards, I'm happy to chat with you, or you can also find George if you're interested in what additional data we have available. We were interested also in their cognitive functioning. That came as an unfunded federal mandate about a year into the study where they said you will start collecting cognitive function data. So we had to find a way over the telephone, because we never see these people other than we send out a company into their home to get their blood pressure, but we, the researchers, never see these people. We had to figure out how to assess their cognitive function over the telephone. When we got into their home, we used the company that those of you that have had insurance visits for life insurance, they'll send someone into your home, they'll collect your blood, they'll check your blood pressure, they want to verify that you're not about to drop dead before this life insurance company invests money in you. We use those very same people to go into the homes of our participants and get blood pressures, to collect blood, heights and weights. This last time around, we actually had them doing timed walks and chair stands so we could get a measure of physical functioning. And we scheduled that centrally. So we worked with this company, which is called EMSI, to do the actual visits, but we did the scheduling right at UAB of the phone call followed with the information sent to EMSI. In the home, we did have to have written informed consent. That's an extra process, too. If you ever want to talk about that, George and I would be happy to talk to you about it. But the process of obtaining consent when we don't actually get to see these people. So we can't have one study coordinator administering consent. You have to find a way to work with your IRB to get the consent signed and then signed by a witness, but not someone who actually works on the study. We also left packets that were self-administered, and these are the ones that are near and dear to my heart because it's how we assess diet. These packets were administered by the EMSI person, but then mailed back to UAB for us to evaluate. Like I said, the food frequency questionnaire, this first line item, is the one that I'm going to spend the most time talking about today, and it's the data that I work with the most frequently. We also have labs. Mary Cushman at the University of Vermont is the PI of our lab, our repository, and we have done several analytes at this point in time, but we always have room for additional ancillary studies if there's a novel analyte you might want to study. We took an ECG in the home as well. The EMSI examiners are very capable of administering ECGs. They do it for the insurance visits. We wanted the ECGs, though, read by one group. We didn't want the EMSI Corporation reading the ECGs, so we sent the ECGs to Wake Forest. And at first it was Ron Prinius, now it's Syed Solomon. this group that's reading the ECGs for us, looking for evidence of MI, AFib, LVH. We also are looking at hard endpoints. Obviously, we're a stroke study, and stroke is the primary endpoint that we are interested in at this point in time in regards. So we call them every 6 months and ask, have you had a stroke? Since we're interested in stroke, we also ask about TIA. We ask about 6 different stroke symptoms to try to get at any possible definition of stroke we can find. Then we pursue their medical records. The medical records are how we determine whether or not the person actually had a stroke. These are the sites throughout the United States. I mentioned the stroke adjudication at the University of Cincinnati. Brett Casella, Dawn Kleindorfer, they're our lead stroke neurologists. We have a stroke neurologist here at Emory, too, who helps us adjudicate medical records, Aaron Anderson. And they all get together once a year to look at these charts together to determine whether or not the participant had a stroke. Our goal was to get a sample throughout the United States that was half black and half white, so clearly we oversampled African Americans. We also wanted half the people to come from the stroke belt, because the stroke belt, which is the region of states, these 8 southern states in the United States, has the highest rate of stroke in the United States. And I won't go into the data on that, but George has been publishing on that for, I won't say how long, but quite a while, that there is a big disparity. And we have more strokes in the South. So you can see that we did a decent job getting our 50% from the Southeast and our 50% from the rest of the country. Like I said, half black, half white, half women, and half men. The diet data is slightly different since it was self-administered. The participants could elect to not send the diet data back to us, and some did. But we used a Block 98 food frequency questionnaire, which has been validated in NHANES, which is a population very similar to our population in terms of demographics. They mailed it back to us at the coordinating center, and we scanned it and then sent it off to California to the block group to analyze the contents of the diet. Nutrition Quest is the parent company of Block, and this is a screenshot from their website. They do all kinds of questionnaires and screeners. They're really one of the best in the country if you want a questionnaire that's representative of multiple cultures, races, ethnicities. They've done a lot of validation in subpopulations. I don't know if anyone's ever taken an FFQ. In my world, we live and breathe this stuff, and sometimes we forget that other people don't see them regularly. But I wanted you to see what a food frequency questionnaire, or FFQ, looks like. Basically, we asked the person to think back over the past year and tell me, how often did you drink tomato juice? Would you say never, a few times per year, once per year, 2 to 3 times per month, once per week, twice per week, and you can see on and on. And then we asked them to guess at how many glasses they had in each serving. So you can see this is a tricky process as we assess diet. It's certainly not the gold standard in diet, but it's the most cost-effective. To give you a perspective of what something like this costs for 30,000 people, which is how many people we have in regards, this cost roughly $1 million just to get diet data, because it's an 8-page questionnaire. We send it off to Block to be analyzed, and they give us tons of data back. If we would have done a more rigorous dietary assessment, we would have been looking at $3 or $4 million to assess diet. So this is why we went with the food frequency questionnaire. It works reasonably well in populations like ours, but certainly you can see where there might be some areas for bias or misreporting. The first example was on beverages. This is an example of actual foods. In this case, these are all fruits. But again, you can get a feel for what the participants would be doing. Only imagine 8 pages of this. It takes about 45 minutes to do. This is why, although we gave 30,239 FFQs out to our participants, and that's how many people we have in regards at baseline, we only got back about 25,000 food frequency questionnaires, which is actually pretty good for diet. We only had 21,000 or 22,000 with usable data. One of the challenges with food frequency questionnaires, even though some people sent them back, they only completed half of the food frequency questionnaire and gave up, or maybe they did every other page, or they skipped line items. But we had an algorithm, a very strict algorithm, that they had to complete at least 95% of the food frequency questionnaire for us to consider it completed. So we talked a little bit about Mediterranean diet and what it was earlier, but what about Mediterranean diet in regards? How do you measure Mediterranean diet? Well, you actually use a score. You sum up all the vegetables, fruits, legumes, cereals, fish, meat, dairy, and the ratio of the monounsaturated fats to the polyunsaturated, or to the saturated fats. And that gives you that olive oil animal fat ratio. We also looked at total alcohol intake rather than breaking out red wine from white wine. That's the way that it's currently recommended, is to use all alcohol intake. Individuals are assigned a value of 1 if they're above the median for any of one of those food groups, and then 0 if they're not. And they get a negative value if they have high intake in meat or dairy. And it's driven by our population. So if you calculate a Mediterranean diet in regards, you can't necessarily apply it to a cohort you might have at Emory. You'd have to regenerate the values within that cohort because you want a median split in whatever cohort you're studying. So if we take a look at what the Mediterranean diet looked like in regards, you get a score from 0 to 9 based on those components I just mentioned. And we split it into 3 roughly equal groups. They're not tertiles because you're looking at whole numbers, and we split them right at the whole number. Most of the folks are falling in that middle category of getting a 4 or a 5 on the Mediterranean diet, which makes sense. We had 5,200 people in the upper end, which would indicate the highest adherence to a Mediterranean diet. If you look through this slide, you can see that there are not big surprises. College graduates were more likely to adhere to a Mediterranean diet in this cell right here. So you can see some kind of an education effect in this particular data. We didn't see much difference by disease condition. And hypertension, you can see the percents are roughly the same, roughly right around 47 to 49%, regardless of adherence to the Mediterranean diet. And we can see that their actual blood pressure values were relatively similar. We then went on to see what was the association of this diet with incident ischemic stroke. That's our primary area of interest in regards. We're always trying to explain why there might be racial and regional differences in stroke. And lots of people have ideas for that. Diet is one of the reasons why people often cite that there are differences in rates of stroke, with African Americans having more stroke and Southerners having more stroke. And the first line item is the crude hazard ratio. We use Cox proportional hazard models to study this effect. And as you go down, you'll notice that more and more factors are thrown into the model. In diet, we're always challenged with what you put into the model because people always argue causal pathway. Depending on what school you're trained in, some schools will say you can't put things like hypertension in a model when you're studying the effect of diet and stroke because hypertension's in the causal pathway to developing a stroke. That said, you have to do what reviewers want to. So I always try to throw all the models that people might want to see when looking at the slide. Regardless of how you slice it, you'll notice that the Mediterranean diet is protective in terms of developing stroke in regards. Those that were most adherent to the Mediterranean diet had the lowest risk of stroke. What about cognitive function? We're always looking at cognitive function data after we look at the stroke data because that's an important thing that our institute has asked us to do. Interestingly, with cognitive function, we found an interaction with diabetes. And this was one that we didn't understand, one that we didn't expect ahead of time. But we noticed as soon as we put diabetes in the model, the estimates they flipped direction. So cognitive decline, or the Mediterranean diet was protective of developing cognitive decline. So the people that were highest adherers to the Mediterranean diet were least likely to decline until we put diabetes in the model. When we put diabetes in the model, all of a sudden Mediterranean diet put people at an increased risk of cognitive decline. So we were very confused by that and decided to test for an interaction to see what was happening, and we found that there was in fact an interaction. People with diabetes had the association we expected to see. You see the 0.81 right down here? That's what we expected to see. We expected to see that higher adherence to a Mediterranean diet would result in lower risk of cognitive decline. But the people with diabetes, it's non-significant, but you can see a trend where Mediterranean diet might be associated with increased rates of cognitive decline. So we plotted it here on the figure, and you can see the differences by age. Cognitive decline is something that's very tightly tied to age as well, which probably won't surprise the people in this room. As we age, we tend to have a decrease in our cognitive performance. But interestingly, these two lines really separated the high adherers and the low adherers in the people without diabetes. So that's something we're continuing to explore further with our diet data. We're not sure why there were differences that we see in cognitive function, but not stroke. It could be that it was a more sensitive measure, but we're continuing to develop it. Another question that we always have in diet is, what if I don't want to put a label on healthy? Let me just tell you that the high adherers in regards, they're really not eating a Mediterranean diet, not the one Ansel Keys described. They're not eating lots of olive oil, lots of legumes, lots of fruits and vegetables. They're just doing that a little bit more than the rest of the people in regards, which makes them a higher adherer, but not a high adherer. So one thing you can do is you can look at the data in your population and see what they're eating without deciding on healthy versus non-healthy. We take this big food frequency questionnaire that has 108 items on it, and we reduce it down to 56 food groups. We originally started with 58 food groups, but found that there were 2 food groups that nobody in regards was eating, so we took it down to 56. We got rid of diet shakes because we didn't have many people eating diet shakes, and we combined the breakfast bars into sweet breakfast foods. This gives you a feel for the sheer volume of data you might have when you're collecting diet data. You can see the food group that we assigned it to over here, 100% fruit juice, and you can see what might fall into that. We put orange juice and fruit juice into that category, but let's take a look at, I want to see one of the mixed dishes ones to show you how, let's see if it's in the next one. To see soup is a good example. Some of these food groups become tough when you're trying to figure out what you might put in there. When we look at soup, this could be vegetable soup, bean soup, lentil soup, and other soup, like chicken noodle, like chili. It can be lots of different things. So it could be that it's coding for something very different than what you intended, but it's the best we have given the instrument we used. We also chose in this particular analysis to break the vegetables out by vegetable class. Some people lump them together, but we kept them all separate in case there were differences by vegetable. You then derive a dietary pattern. We use fancy statistical techniques called factor analysis to look at what foods people are likely to eat together. Again, we don't assume that something's healthy or unhealthy. We just allow the diet to show us what people were eating together. We did it using split sample replication, which means we looked at the patterns in half of our cohort and we saved the other half of the cohort to the side. Then we replicated it in the other half of the cohort to see if the patterns were actually consistent across these 2 different sections of the cohort. We did find that there was good validity between the first sample and the second sample, so we were able to move forward with the actual factor analysis. With the factor analysis, if you have 56 food groups, you actually get 56 patterns. That's what comes out the other side of the factor analysis. You have to take a look at those 56 patterns and decide, where do we actually think most of the variability is being explained? In our case, we had 5 factors where most of the variability was being explained. This was more factors than had been previously identified by other cohort studies. MESA had done a factor analysis that had 4 factors, but ours had 5, and you'll see why this becomes tough when you start to interpret these factors. In factor 1, we had people eating a lot of mixed dishes, pasta, Mexican, pizza, red meat, soup. Sound like a lot of mixed dishes without, a specific food. In factor 2, you see a lot of the veg, so that was the cruciferous, all the different types. Some fish, beans, cereal, vegetable mixed dishes, and whole grain breads. In factor 3, we saw miscellaneous sugar being the highest loading. That means every place you add sugar, whether it's coffee or dessert type foods, but then also desserts, bread, chocolate, candy, added fats. That means people that are adhering to this pattern, that's the foods that they're consuming regularly. A lot of people said to me, that pattern doesn't even make sense, a lot of the scientists that I work with. Nobody eats that way. And I said, you didn't work in a factory in Paris, Texas. People go to the vending machine, they pick up Twinkies, they pick up whatever you can get for 50 cents to run right back out to the diaper machine and get that machine working again. I believe this could be a pattern. I've seen people like this. The next one was fried food, organ meat, processed meats, egg, added fat. You can see this is a pretty fatty pattern. And the last one is baffling. I always wish that we would have drawn the line at 4 factors so we wouldn't have had this factor. But this one is salad dressing, green leafy vegetables, wine, butter, liquor, coffee, and a little bit of added condiments like salad dressings. I have no idea this pattern. Lots of people love to say the faculty diet. I gave a talk in New York once. They said, oh, it's the Upper East Side diet. I don't know many people who eat this way exactly, but it is a pattern that we identified. So this is a summary again of these 5 patterns, and we gave them a name because usually you give them a label so that you're not calling it factor 1, factor 2, factor 3, and it doesn't mean anything. We called the first one convenience because it seemed to be full of foods where people might be eating out. Maybe they're eating packaged food, but they couldn't identify the individual foods in their diet. We called the second one plant-based because it was so high in fruits, vegetables, and legumes. The third one we called sweets for obvious reasons that we just talked about. The fourth one was the source of much internal heated debate, but eventually was called Southern because it loaded heavily in foods that were consistent with a Southern dietary pattern. And the last one we just called alcohol and salads. We didn't really know what to name that one. The reason we came up with Southern for that fourth pattern, typically when people have done this type of analysis before, they come up with a healthy pattern that's some type of a combination of what we saw in the plant-based and what we saw in the alcohol, and then an unhealthy pattern that they tend to call Western. But since we were in the South, we were looking at whether or not we had regional differences in these diet patterns. And if you look at the 10 states with the greatest adherence to the Southern diet, they are mainly Southern states, which that also gave us some comfort that it was okay to call it a Southern diet. I was confused by the sweets, fats, and the Southern because they're both basically unhealthy patterns when you look at the foods that we're loading. And so I wanted to take a look at what states are adhering to the sweets, fats. You'll see here it's kind of a mix, but it tends to be some of that Appalachia area and then out west, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota. How do these patterns differ by age? Whenever you create your own dietary pattern that without reference to whether or not it's healthy, you want to look at who's eating that particular pattern. In the convenience pattern, we see the mean scores going up as age goes down in our cohort, which kind of gives us some comfort that this is a convenience pattern. These are probably the working individuals who don't have a ton of time to prepare food, and that's why so many of these meals appeared to be Mexican, pizza, pasta. In the healthy diet pattern, we notice that it's decreasing with age. So that means that as in our cohort, the older folks are more likely to eat this healthy style than the younger folks, which we do sometimes see that phenomenon in other cohorts, where as people age, they tend to eat a healthier style of diet. And in the alcohol, we also notice this one to be similar to the convenience and that the younger folks were eating more likely to eat this pattern. Well, what about by race? Race was tricky because we see these big differences in terms of adherence to the Southern diet pattern. And I've often wondered how much of the Southern diet pattern is more cultural in terms of being more of an African-American style eating than a straight Southern style of eating. But George always argues to me that he knows lots of people in North Carolina that ate the foods in the Southern diet. But here we see African-Americans more likely to adhere to the Southern diet than their white counterparts. Negative would be a lower adherence to that particular diet. We also see some race differences by the convenience and the alcohol pattern. What about education? The biggest difference in education was this convenience diet. The college graduates were more likely to consume this diet than the people that hadn't graduated from college, which could indicate that it's a slightly more expensive diet. Same thing is true here of the healthy diet. We've got college graduates more likely to consume a healthy style of eating, less likely to have the sweets pattern, less likely to have the Southern pattern, and by far and away, very far more likely to include or to follow this alcohol-based pattern. One of the other interesting things that we noticed was that in terms of adherence by race, it differed by education, the association with education differed by race. We see a big split here in the whites, which is what you saw on that previous slide, where the college graduates seem to be less likely to consume the sweets pattern, and there's a nice gradient across college grad down to not graduating from high school. But in the blacks in regards, they're all clustered in that same area regardless of education. So that was one of the interesting findings that I didn't expect to see. I keep this comment in here because I love to be reminded of our participants. Our participants are everything to us in regards. They've stayed with us for 15 years, And we published a paper on fried fish. Fadi Nahab, who's a neurologist right here at Emory. And it got a little bit of press. It actually made it into the popular press. And one of the participants called me and said, "Are you Suzanne Judd, the one who authored this paper on fried fish?" And I thought, yes. What would you like to talk to me about? He said, "Well, you got it all wrong. I've been living in the South for the past 50 years. I'm 83 years old, and I don't eat any fried fish, and I don't eat any fried chicken. But it's not just fried fish. It's also fried vegetables, fried everything that we eat down here." And then he went on, this was literally a 30-minute conversation, he went on to tell me he has not been eating fried food because his wife loves him and his friends' wives do not. He was telling me how she read something in their 20s about how fried food might be bad for you. This was probably, again, right around the 1950s, 60s, coming out of Ansel Keys' work and some other folks at the University of Minnesota. And they changed their eating style. And he said, eventually my wife was proven right, and it's true that high-fat food does kill you. But by the time their friends' wives had figured this out, they didn't love their husbands anymore, so they didn't change their cooking. It was a very funny conversation, but it always reminds me of the importance of the people that are in our study. Let's take a look at stroke, because like I've said, that's what we do in regards. It's the heart and soul of what we do. When we look at the risk of stroke by quintile of that plant-based pattern, it was the second factor, we see what we would expect to see. A healthier style of eating seems to be protective of stroke as we go across from quartile 1 to quartile 4. Those in quartile 4 are most likely to eat this plant-based style of eating, and they're least likely to have a stroke, similar to what we saw with the Mediterranean diet score. Now, what about Southern pattern? Here we see the exact opposite. As you go across these 4 quartiles, the folks that are heavily eating that Southern diet pattern are more likely to have a stroke. No matter what we adjust for in the model, it still stays the same in that they're more likely to have a stroke. More importantly for us in regards, we're usually not just trying to identify predictors of stroke. We're trying to identify predictors for the racial disparity or the regional disparity in stroke. And in this particular analysis, the thing that I found most interesting is we see that hazard ratio go from 1.38. This is the hazard ratio for how much more likely African Americans are to have a stroke in regards. The hazard ratio is about 1.38. But when we put in that Southern diet pattern, it attenuates it down to 1.12. So we're seeing that Southern diet pattern explain about 63% of the racial disparity in stroke, which is very powerful. George has a separate paper that looks at all the different things that mediate this association, and diet, especially the Southern diet pattern, seems to be one of the biggest mediators. You'll notice I broke this out by age, and I don't want to spend too much time talking about this today, but the reason it's done that way is the racial disparity in stroke is actually particularly bad in the youngest people. By the time you hit age 65, there's not a big difference in the racial disparity in stroke. I want to go back and throw these back up because I know there was a lot of information the first time, and that was before I had showed you any data. These are the foods that loaded in each of those individual factors, so you can get a feel, again, for what was in those factors. Factor 4 is that Southern pattern again, and you do see lots of processed meats and fried food. And then factor 2, the pattern that was protective, that's where you see lots of the lean poultry. If it says poultry, it means skin was taken off and it was not fried because we separated out the fried from non-fried foods. And you see the whole grains and the things that we would expect in a healthy pattern. Factor 1, 3, and 5 were not associated with stroke, and I didn't want to throw up a bunch of results. Basically, those were all null. What could the patterns actually be measuring? This is one of the things I spend a lot of time thinking about, especially now that we have a second food frequency questionnaire, and we can look at what people are eating 10 years after baseline. The factors could be measuring something totally different than diet. Could be measuring genetic determinants of diet. If you believe that you eat what your body's telling you to eat, there could be some type of underlying genetic mechanism for what food choice you have that may also influence your health risk. They could be measuring socioeconomic status. This is a fight I love to have with George because I do believe that there is something going on in these patterns, and we're actually doing a better job measuring socioeconomic status by looking at gradient of adherence to these dietary patterns. Something you can't ask by saying, how much education do you have? I just don't have a way to prove it yet. It's my next 10 years. It could talk about culture. The question becomes, is it current culture that influences what somebody eats, or is it their childhood? Do you still eat the same way you ate as a child? What do most Americans do? Do they tend to stick with what they learned from their parents, or do they migrate toward a healthier pattern? It could also have something to do with intention to lose weight, which is something very different than unintentional weight loss in the nutrition community. It's possible that once someone starts wanting to lose weight, they change the way they report their diet going forward, even if they don't actually change their diet. The next question that I have started working on recently, and most of my recent grants talk about this, it's this role of family, friends, and the environment, trying to figure out what's going on with food. We know eating's not done in isolation, and for most of your patients, especially your elderly patients, they probably are not eating by themselves. In particular, stroke survivors, they're less likely to prepare their own food because they often have physical limitations as they're going forward, and so they've got to bring in their family to help with food preparation. If you look at the data that's out there, national estimates, roughly 80% of the food we consume is eaten with someone else there. Again, that can depend individual to individual, but most of the time we're eating with somebody there. Family can sink or swim diet change. I'm sure some of you have seen that in your own patients or maybe in your own life, that the family support can be critical. So sometimes we need to advocate for a change at the family level rather than just the individual patient level. It's also important to understand the built environment. The built environment influences people's everyday life. It's often influenced by how wealthy the neighborhood is. It often has something to do with their access to food. You hear a lot in the news about food deserts. Although in the scientific community we've gone away from thinking about what a food desert is, because it turns out often if we go into a food desert and provide healthy food, people don't choose to eat the healthy food. So there's more to it than just having access. It's also about the pollution that's in the area and what people are breathing every single day, the mold that's in their home. It has to do with their ability to move. One of the studies we're looking at right now is how the built environment influences rehabilitation following a stroke. Opportunity is a part of the built environment. Are there jobs around where the people live? Can they get where they need to get in their immediate community? There's this quote that came from the Southern Poverty Law Center, and it's actually cities, but I've changed it to communities. Cities are a place to catch something, like maybe a new idea, or a diet, or a lifestyle. In regards, currently, the neighborhood measures we have are county-level stroke mortality, which basically looks at the county you live in and looks to see how many people have died of stroke in that county. It's how we knew there was a geographic difference in stroke mortality. We also have neighborhood socioeconomic status that we've modeled using the census tract level. The census tract is somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000 people, depending on where you live, if you're in a very dense area or not very dense area. It was originally derived, the neighborhood measure that we used, by Ana Diaz-Rue, who was looking at ERIC at 6 census measures, which include household income, median value of the housing units, percent of the households that receive interest or rental income, the number of adults that have graduated high school, the number of adults percent of adults that are 25 years or older that have completed college, and the percent unemployed, or percent employed in executive, managerial, or professional specialty occupations. The census has so many variables. There are literally thousands of variables, and what Anna did originally was take all of those variables and do a factor analysis, just like I did with diet, to see which variables hang together to create some kind of a score for these neighborhoods, and these were the 6 she identified. Again, we used regards to do this study, and we're, again, interested in stroke as our primary outcome. We use simply sodium intake rather than the dietary patterns, as it's known that sodium, high sodium intake can be a risk factor for hypertension, which then puts you at risk for stroke and kidney disease. So we wanted to see, using sodium intake as the proxy for diet, what happens as neighborhood SES increases and what happens as stroke mortality at the county increases. And interestingly, we found that as the neighborhood socioeconomic status increases, stroke mortality at the county level decreases. So these were directly correlated with one another. But again, as we found in the diet data, there are racial differences in this association. It was much stronger in whites than blacks. Neither neighborhood nor stroke mortality significantly correlated with individual level sodium intake. So this is not community level. This is specifically in regards what the people were consuming in terms of sodium. And we didn't have any big interactions with race in terms of the association with stroke. In this population of about 17,000, so we went from the 30,000 down to 17,000. Not sure what happened there, sorry. You can see that there are big differences by income and education, which makes sense because we had specifically designed some of these measures around neighborhood level socioeconomic status. And then there are some differences in terms of race in the first and fourth quartile of neighborhood socioeconomic status. The stroke mortality quartiles are race specific, so that's why you don't see differences from the first to the fourth. And what we found was, if we looked at those dietary factors and the area level factors together, that there were some differences by neighborhood socioeconomic status, such that as neighborhoods became more affluent, they were less likely to observe strokes in that neighborhood. Similar to county level mortality, as you live in a county that tends to have more strokes, individual stroke risk in regards increased. And with sodium, we saw a slight increase in risk of stroke in terms of how much sodium they were eating. What was very interesting was when we threw all of these variables in the model together, that neighborhood socioeconomic status variable, it was still associated with decreased stroke risk. So the more affluent a neighborhood is, the less likely folks in the neighborhood are to have a stroke. But the county level stroke mortality variable was no longer significant. And that sodium variable was pretty much hanging in there right where it was before. So this is the data that we've used to get another R01 to take a look at what part of the built environment could it be. And we've bought a database from this company called NETS. It's literally every single business that's ever paid tax since 1990 is in this database. And we're able to aggregate these businesses together to look where our participants live, what types of businesses do they have access to. We're also doing Google Map audits where we're looking at their neighborhood with our eyeballs to see if their sidewalks are intact. Do they have stoplights? Do they have stop signs? Are there bike paths? Are there churches nearby? Do they have access to recreational facilities? And we've got this army of undergrads that's basically looking at Google Maps to characterize all of this for us. Great undergraduate research. In conclusion, what we've done so far, there are factors that are related to diet that underlie some of these racial and regional differences in stroke that we see. At the moment, we see this neighborhood level socioeconomic status being a very strong predictor of stroke risk, but it's going to be interesting to bring in some additional data so we can figure out what is in that variable of neighborhood socioeconomic status. Is it truly just the income and the education of the people around our participants, or is there more to this data? Other dietary factors that people can examine if they're interested and that we've done some analyses on are vitamin D, sodium-potassium ratio, eggs, flavonoids. Someone in the audience today actually did the flavonoid analysis. We have serum B12 and folate. We've also got dietary B12 and folate, dairy, Life Simple 7, alcohol, fiber. There are tons of different options when you're thinking about diet. To come back to what I said in the beginning, because I realized as I give these talks to physicians, they don't really care so much about the diet data that I'm presenting. They just want to know, what am I supposed to tell my patients, because eating a Mediterranean diet doesn't make sense to a lot of folks. And I hate to admit it, but Michael Pollan, who is a journalist, probably said it better than anybody else could have when he said, eat food, mostly plants, not too much. So that's kind of the take-home message that you can take to your patients and in your own life as you're thinking about making dietary changes. Thank you for your attention today. Yeah.
So I don't know if that's on or not, but I'm struggling with the role of hypertension here. You know, we learned all the hypertension trials, the biggest impact of reducing blood pressure is typically on stroke, yet hypertension doesn't seem to poke its head up too much here.
You're right.
Help me figure that out.
I actually left out, I have another slide that says, what I already told you was the fried chicken. I have another one that says, so what I already told you it was the hypertension. We did several models where we looked at people that had hypertension and didn't have a hypertension, and the association is exactly the same. whether someone has baseline hypertension or they don't have hypertension. We have not looked to see if these diets predict incident hypertension. That would be something that I can't believe we haven't thought about yet, George, but that is something we should definitely take a look at.
We've got a paper ready to be submitted, and one of the fascinating things is why quite difference in incident hypertension. The Southern diet explains 50% of the difference in the incidence of hypertension in blacks versus whites in men, and 26%.
Please use the microphones. Thank you.
I'm sorry.
So we're broadcasting. If you could use the microphone back there, that would be a big help to people at the other sites could hear.
We recently have received some of that incident hypertension data. We just finished collecting a second round of in-home visits, which is why we don't have a ton of it yet. But go ahead, George.
No, what I was saying is one of the exciting papers we're looking at is trying to understand the racial disparity in the incidence of hypertension. African Americans start developing hypertension at about 2 decades before their white counterparts. And surprisingly to many people, that excess incidence of hypertension carries forward all the way to age 85. So an 85-year-old black is more likely to develop hypertension than an 85-year-old white. About 50% of the disparity in the incidence of hypertension is explained by the Southern diet in men and about 26% in women, which is by far the single largest contributor to why African Americans have this remarkable and unfortunate excess burden of hypertension, which is probably the main driver of the 5-year difference in life expectancy.
Yeah, so thank you, Suzanne.
You're welcome.
I was on your thesis committee. You've come a long way since then, haven't you? So the question is related to what Bob just was asking, and it's salt. And what about urinary specimens and multiple urinary specimens? Because you've got a unique resource here with regards. And is that coming down the pike, so to speak? Because I have less confidence in nutritional surveys with my colleagues, asking people what they eat and then trying to figure out how much sodium chloride is in it. It just doesn't work very well. And we also want urine, but even then perhaps multiple specimens. So make some comment. What should we tell our patients also about how much salt?
So I have another comment I often put in the slide. I'm going to Bordeaux in January in 6 months. The French have offered to have me for 6 months to quantify Mediterranean diet in Bordeaux, France, which is incredible. I was very surprised and honored by that. But the French have a saying, which is pour votre santé, évitez de manger du salé, du gras, et du sucré. And it's avoid eating salt, sugar, and fat. There's no specific around that particular number, and I think that we are in the same boat here in the United States. We've attempted to say people at high risk should eat 1,500 milligrams of sodium or less. African Americans should eat 1,500 milligrams of sodium or less. I gave a talk one time to a group of nurses, and a nurse raised her hand and said, "Have you ever tried to eat 1,500 milligrams of sodium?" And I said, "No, I have not." And she said, "Well, I think you should try before you tell other people to do it." And I tried. I took her advice, and I tried, and it was hard. It was virtually impossible. You can't eat processed food, and you can't eat bread. A lot of food has sodium. So when you're telling people to avoid sodium, I generally tell them to look at the nutrition label to start knowing how to read it, but then also to look in the grain products, because those processed grains are the highest source of sodium in the diet for the most part. Chips, potato chips, things like that. So that's where I point them in that direction. But you're right. It's sodium in particular is, people think it's the salt they sprinkle, but it's not. Any other questions?
Do we have questions from other sites? Is there somebody collecting those? Okay. So I guess maybe you're going to talk about this at 5 o'clock, but where does kidney disease fit into this spectrum?
That's a great question, and some of this we're going to talk about at 5 o'clock, in addition to diet data at 5 o'clock. But we have looked at the Southern pattern, and the folks that are adhering to a Southern diet pattern are far more likely to go on to develop end-stage renal disease. We haven't done the incident CKD bit yet because we just got the incident CKD data. But we certainly do see some strong ties with the Southern pattern in ESRD, which is kind of far down the line. We'd like to prevent it way before then.
Oh, no, I was struck at the beginning of your talk with mentioning that people who don't eat 3 meals a day, if they skip some meals or skip some days, seem to do better. Mm-hmm. And it struck me that folks who observe Ramadan go through a whole month of a pattern where they're not eating during daylight. Do they derive some, in addition to whatever religious benefit, is there actually some benefit then to them nutritionally?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we actually see, we've studied folks, not me personally, but there are scientists out there who have looked at it. HDL levels go up before and after Ramadan, and you also tend to see weight loss during Ramadan. So yes, I think, like I said, if you want to know where the nutrition world is going, fasting has become the area that we're finding the most interesting data. It seems to be where you can get the best bang for your buck in terms of weight loss, because they get to eat the foods they want. They just don't eat them during certain times. And we also have other religious cultures we can study in terms of fasting and regular fasting. But if you want to talk anthropologically, you could argue, it's sugar that's in the diet, it's fat in the diet, but one of the biggest cultural changes that's happened in the last 50 years is the loss of religiosity. And most cultures have a fasting component to their religion, but as we've lost our religiosity, people don't fast regularly anymore. So some are arguing that perhaps this weight gain we've seen is this loss of routine fasting.
Thank you again for a wonderful talk. We look forward to your next one at 5 o'clock, and everybody's invited.
Yep. George will be with me too, so thank you.